Tonight's lecture is titled Dear Del, Dear Juanita, Two Friends in the Contest for Truth, Fact, and Perspective in Mormon History. And it will be given by Dr. Richard Saunders, who is an academic librarian and former Dean of Library Services at the Southern Utah University. He is a graduate of Utah State University. He holds a library degree from Brigham Young University, and he received a PhD from the University at Memphis with an emphasis on the social history of recent America. He is also professionally accredited by the Academy of Certified Archivists. His professional work includes service with the Utah Historical Society, Montana State University, in the production side of commercial publishing, and with the University of Tennessee at Martin. In addition to his work as a professional librarian, Dr. Saunders has conducted historical research across the U.S. and has published widely on a variety of topics, which include Yellowstone literature, early Utah printing, Montana history, the civil rights movement in rural areas during the 1950s and 60s, the Tennessee novelist Harry Kroll, and Del Morgan, about whom we will also hear more in a few minutes. After tonight's lecture, I would like to invite everyone in attendance to meet with Dr. Saunders. If you would like to do so, just head down the stairs on the left of the auditorium and directly through the doors on the left as well. At this point, I'd like to have you all join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Saunders.
Good evening. I nearly missed my cue. I'm a bit of a storyteller and a lot of a ham. And so rather than reading you something that you're probably not terribly interested in the form that it is, I thought I'd talk my way through it. I wish we had time to sit up and just chew the fat and tell stories, because you know far more about Juanita Brooks and her past. In the light? Don't go to the light! Better?
Get the mic closer.
Mike.
Doesn't matter where you go.
When it comes back. Okay, here we go. I'm sorry. I'm a storyteller who's interested in the why. Now, Juanita Brooks is an institution. I'm talking in her adopted hometown in St. George. You know who she is. But I wonder if you know why she is. What makes Juanita a hero or a heroine? I titled this when I began writing, Dear Dale, Dear Juanita, and I'm talking about a couple of friends. And I'm going to talk about all of those things. But through all this process, I'm going to try and help you understand why. What makes her into a couple of things? Obviously, you know who Juanita is. She's more than just a writer, although she is that. She has been called a heroic writer. Not as much recently, but that's because we haven't told those stories as often. But during the 1960s and the 1970s, she was repeatedly called a heroic writer. That made me wonder, why? Why is she a heroic writer? What makes her into a heroic writer? And I guess if you ask the question, why is Juanita Brooks a heroic writer, not just a writer, not just a female, not just an American, not just a Southern Utahn, but a heroic writer, what does that mean? I think you can probably rephrase that question by doing a couple of other things. We have to ask, in the practice of her time, what is it that makes Juanita Brooks who she is? And I think there's some very good answers, very curious answers. And yes, it's all about Juanita, but I want to talk about not just Juanita, of who she is as a person, because you know those stories far better than I do. I want to understand who she is as an entity. So if we could talk about it in this sense, there's actually another question. And that's all tied to the idea of, where do heroes come from? Heroes don't just evolve. You don't walk down the street and say, "Hi, hero," unless you're carrying a sandwich. But people who are heroes come out of conflict of some sort. Now, often we talk about heroes in a military sense, and I understand that. As a civil rights historian, I know some other heroes who were not in combat, but were in combat. There is a different kind of hero. What makes Juanita a hero in a heroic sense? And that implies one other thing, and that is, what was the conflict? And that's really what I'm after tonight, okay? So I'll tell you a little bit about a whole bunch of things. First off, if you happen to be a Latter-day Saint, you have to understand what a Latter-day Saint is when you spell things out. Now, you won't be able to hear me say Latter-day Saint, either top or bottom. So please understand, there is a difference. Typically, modern historians are beginning to use the top version, or the abbreviated version, as a way to talk about the broad culture, not just those in Utah, but those in Independence, Missouri, and in Clitheroe, Minnesota, and lots of other places. So that's the large D. The hyphen and the small d is the ones that are headquartered in Salt Lake, okay? So there is a difference. It's beginning to be used more broadly, but this is the kind of context you need in order to make sense out of things. Juanita is a hyphen small d Latter-day Saint, but she is part of a whole bunch of things that are happening in the larger sense as well. Okay? Fair enough? All right, here we go. If we're going to talk about Juanita, sorry, I can't see it very well. If we're going to talk about Juanita, we have to start talking about who she is as an individual. Now, of course, we're going to, let me back up. What I'm going to tell you today is a version of philosophy that's called historiology. Now, it never gets used. Don't worry about it if you don't know it. It's a new word. It's okay. Historiography, which more people will have heard, is the study of the way stories have been told and written down. Historiology is the way that history itself is used within a culture, within a group. Okay? So, we're going to do a couple of things to play this game that I'm going to call in history. We're going to start with a timeline, and if you recognize the timeline, you will know that 1830 is obviously the beginning of the Latter-day Saint movement. That's with a small capital D. We'll go up to the present, and that's way too long for the talk that I'm going to give tonight. Although, if someone would please wave me off at midnight, I'll try and get you out by 1. Okay? We're going to choose a snippet out of this. We'll put a pin in the timeline, say at 1935, and there's a reason for that, but trust me, let's just say 1935. We'll put a second pin in the map at 1950, and if you know Juanita Brooks, you might know something about where I'm going with this. These are the years that Juanita was learning her craft. She was beginning to do something new, or was participating in something new, okay? So we're going to take this little box of history, and we're going to kind of pull it apart. Now, when you and I are threading a needle, or when we're looking at details or something like that, we get real close in focus, right? I'm going to do a little bit of that. We're going to do some focusing on this period at a very low level, and then we're going to do some other things. We're going to step back a little bit, and we'll talk about the same period from a little broader perspective, and then we're going to get really high where details disappear, and we're going to look at very broad stuff. Okay? That's how this story gets told. It's a bad metaphor, but it's what you could consider a concentric timeline. Okay? Now, timelines, we think in Western culture of timelines as straight things that go from the past into the future, right? It's a little problematic. We'll leave physics out of this, but it's the way that we think of things. So we're going to kind of look at that way. We're going to do 3 things, and we're going to talk about Juanita specifically. We'll talk about Juanita Brooks, and we will talk about Dale Morgan, who you don't know yet, don't worry. We'll also step back in that second level or layer, and we'll talk about the broader context of the time that they're writing at the time. Okay, so this is between 1935 and 1950. And then we're going to get way back and look down on things and see what it looks like. And that's what historiology is. And we have to do broader because it's my talk and I can do that. All right, so let's talk first about Juanita Brooks and Dale Morgan. You know Juanita Brooks is from a small town, Bunkerville. She comes to St. George. She does lots of interesting things. She was a person who also was not a custodian, but a participant in the local open secret. Okay? She understood, or had beginning to understand, she lived suffused with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Now, this is only the first year or two that she's even really kind of paying attention to things. So this is 1934, 1935. She's beginning to learn that the city is a place where some stories are told with a privilege involved. This is my grandfather. This is his story of what happened. This is my uncle. This is who it is. Anyway, she has an encounter with Nephi Johnson about 1919. Nephi Johnson was a participant in the massacre. He was there on the ground. She doesn't get to write his story, and that really kind of kicks things off for her. She becomes at least interested in the thing. She goes to BYU in 1925, goes from BYU eventually and graduates from BYU in 1925. She's there earlier than that. And then she goes to Columbia University and earns a master's degree, which was a professional credential that would get her into teaching in most places, including the University of Chicago at that point. She comes back to St. George, and she goes to work here at Dixie. Interestingly enough, it wasn't history that interested her. She was interested in writing, and she did her degree in English, not in history, and she taught English. That was what she did. So how do you go from English to history? Well, it involved a couple of people, mostly this character right here who nobody knows, or a few people know. How many people know who Nels Anderson is? Okay, we've got a few folks that do. Nels Anderson was a young man who had been literally hoboing across the United States. His family was from Michigan. He ended up in Clover Valley over yonder and worked there for a while, and eventually decided after hoboing for a number of years, he was tired of that and was going to go to school. Well, the closest thing was Dixie, so he comes and he begins going to his high school years here in his early 20s. Nels Anderson then goes to BYU a few years before Juanita does, and he graduates with a degree in 1920. And then, interestingly enough, he goes to the University of Chicago. Nels Anderson, although very few people remember him, was a brilliant mind and a very, very, very good writer. If you ever get the chance, I strongly encourage you to track down a copy of his autobiography. There was not a copy in the state of Utah. I know I looked for it. Fascinating character, doesn't mention Juanita, unfortunately. But in 1934, he had gone to work for the federal government and had, having been in St. George, knew Juanita, lived through the block or around the corner, someplace very close, shortly after she and Will Brooks married. And he encouraged her to set up, he called her actually on the telephone, encouraged her to set up a Federal Emergency Relief Administration project in St. George, in fact in her house, to transcribe diaries and autobiographies. That's her introduction to the beginning of history. Prior to that, she'd done some very good writing and actually had written a couple of pieces for Nels Anderson. But that was her first real introduction to the process of history. Nels Anderson lived to a ripe old age, not quite as long as Juanita does, ended up in Canada and completely ignored by Utah, and despite his contribution, he writes a book called Desert Saints in 1942, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay? But there's also another person that's involved, and you'll notice this guy is a lot younger than Nels Anderson. This is Dale Morgan. Now, truthfully, how many people have ever heard of Dale Morgan besides my wife? Okay, so there's a few people who do. Dale Morgan, Nels Anderson introduces Juanita Brooks to history and to documents and to the way things work. But Dale Morgan makes her, helps her, guides her, teaches her, creates this character that in 15 years will produce one of the great books of modern LDS history. Okay? Dale Morgan was born in Salt Lake City, 1914. He was very talented, had a near photographic memory, intimidates me terribly, but he was completely deaf. Completely and absolutely nerve deaf, could not hear anything. He was postlingual, if that matters. He had probably a bacterial meningitis infection when he was 14, lost his hearing and much of his balance, had to learn to walk again. 1930, well, we'll get to the story of the rest of it. Anyway, he was a fascinating character. And he became Juanita's mentor. He was the one that really helped her become who she was. So when we talk about two friends, they really were two friends. They were very, very close. Very, very close. Now, I'm not saying intimate in some creepy, weird way. No. They trusted each other immensely. In fact, Morgan and Juanita Brooks made a deal long before she ever started writing on the massacre, because Morgan was interested in it, and we'll get to that one in a second. Okay, so let's talk about how to make this work. There's our timeline again. Can you see it reasonably well? Okay, so this is the first part of it. This is microhistory. This is how Juanita Brooks becomes a historian. Okay? Now we'll start with the beginning. We've talked about 1935. In 1936 and 1937, she makes two remarkable discoveries, documentary discoveries on her own, both of them first-hand accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And she thinks, now if this was me, I would think, too. It's a fantastic find. And it starts to make her think, what else is out there? More importantly, why don't these two things match the stories that I'm hearing on the streets of St. George and in Relief Society meetings and other places like that? Something is not right, and she's going to figure it out. So what she does in 1940 is that she does a presentation to the Utah Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters that, as best I can tell, now Dale's and Juanita's letters do not survive for this period, so we don't know. I'm inferring based on what I know of them. Juanita makes a presentation about these two documents. That's her first introduction, formal introduction to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Now it's important because in 1938, Dale Morgan is hired by the Historical Records Survey. The Historical Records Survey is a parallel project. It was a relief project during the Depression. But it was a parallel project to the National Archives. National Archives had only been founded in 1932. The Historical Records Survey is founded in 1934. It's to do on a local level what is happening at a governmental level, so that people in the counties and in the cities all across the country are trying to find out what records exist in our community. There's a long story that's all involved with that, but I won't go into that too far. The important thing is they begin writing to each other. Dale is doing the official county history for the Historical Records Survey for Washington County. And he is told by somebody who's writing down here, you really need to send this to Juanita Brooks. She's a good writer. She knows the area. Talk with her. They start corresponding back and forth in 1939. They also end up meeting. Dale comes down in February of 1941, and for the first time, they've been corresponding for a year and a half, they actually get to talk to each other. Well, talk is a relative term. You'll notice the picture that I had up there? Juanita is writing because she cannot speak with Dale. He doesn't hear. He can't hear anything. But that's not the only thing. Obviously, in the middle of this whole process, we're dealing with the Second World War. Now, everybody understood war was coming. And it was a challenge because in the process of the World War II, the Historical Records Survey and a number of other WPA projects disappear. So what do you do with all the history? All of Juanita's transcripts that she and the people who worked with her had generated disappeared into the files of the Historical Records Survey, and they were ignored for a long time until Dale Morgan found them. And he decided, hey, we can make use of these. These are really good. Okay, we figured out why she's a hero yet? No, okay, it's a trick question. Okay, 1942, Now, in 1941, Dale and Juanita are talking about the massacre. They understand something is going on, but they're not exactly sure what. 1941, I think, best I can tell, Juanita tells Dale, I really want to do something about the massacre. It needs to be written about. She doesn't know what. She's never published anything other than a couple of stories, and they're very, very, very well written. But she's starting to think in kind of the same terms. How about if I tell the story of the massacre? Morgan suggests, well, why don't we take it to Harper's? Harper's is a national publisher, publishes things like this. I'll bet they'd be interested. So, 1942, she sends Morgan a draft of her article. It's a longish draft, but there's a problem. Morgan doesn't return it to her for a year. Now, come on, give him some credit. In 1942, he also, a month after she gives him the manuscript, he moves to Washington, D.C. So it's buried in his stuff. But it takes a year, and by the time he gets finished reading it, he starts thinking, he says, Juanita, this is way too big a story. You can't tell it in Harper's. Because, and Juanita knew it, it's a risky cultural thing. You're going to be writing about some things that are going to be really hard to write about. So you can't just write a story. You can't tell the story like you did in the article on her grandfather's polygamy. You can't do it the water's in. It's not going to fly. You've got to tell and document and prove you know what you're talking about. And so in 1943, when he returns her manuscript, he gives her an outline. Here are the major questions you are going to have to address. Here are the subjects that you're going to have to treat. Here are the concerns you're going to have to deal with if you're going to make this thing work without getting crucified in your hometown. And that's a little scary for a very good reason. 1945, it takes Juanita basically 2 years to craft a draft of her article from article into a book-length manuscript. Now, she did all the work herself. But at the same time, remember, Dale Morgan is sitting in Washington, D.C. He spends every lunch hour and every day after work sitting in 3 blocks away in National Archives, going through newspapers, or the Library of Congress, going through newspapers, going through the federal records of the Indian Affairs Office, the State Department records, everything. Dale is feeding her page, actually, sheaf after sheaf after sheaf after sheaf of transcripts. He finds the Carleton report. He finds the Ashield printing on Porter Rockwell. He finds all kinds of material that she had absolutely no access to in St. George, Utah. She could not tell the story without it, and if she didn't use it, that leaves her open. Now, this is not unique. Dale did this to all kinds of people. It's not just her, but he does it for her first, and that's a real asset. In 1945, after she sends it to him, he takes a very, very careful read and goes all the way through, sends it back, and I can't tell you the text that he said, but basically she was hurt that he had marked it up so heavily. I think that's a mark of a good scholar, that she kept writing. The challenge becomes then all of a sudden, what happens in 1947? Right. What happens when you have a centennial, something that's culturally important? All of a sudden, the stories come out of the proverbial woodwork, right? Everybody wants to have a noble past. 1947, the Pioneer Centennial. I wish I had time to tell you the story of the Pioneer Centennial. I won't get to that tonight. 1948, she sends back, after another 2 years worth of work, she sends back the manuscript to Morgan. Now, she sent it to other people too. Nels Anderson was one of them who introduced her to history. But in 1948, he sends it back and he says, you're getting close. This is good. This is really good, but you've still got some things to do. She says, okay. They meet. He comes back. Actually, she goes up to Salt Lake City and meets Morgan. He has come back from Washington, D.C. That's where this picture was taken. And then they meet again a little bit later. And Morgan is saying, yes, you're close. You can make this work. 1949, or 48, yep, it's 48. 1948, she sends it back to him for a 4th time. Nels Anderson only saw it once. She sent it to Morgan 4 times. And he says, I think you're ready. Now, there was an argument between me and myself about who sent Juanita to Stanford University Press. I think that it may have been Nels Anderson. However, I also think it may have been Dale Morgan. I know for a fact Juanita did not approach the press. That was Dale Morgan. Morgan was the one that says, I think you want to send it out of state. You've got to send it to some place that is respectable and responsible and that cannot take a hit from anything that the keepers of history in Salt Lake City might say. It's got to be impeccable. So it goes to Stanford University Press, and they say yes. And then eventually, 1949, she submits the manuscript, and we have a book by 1950. Juanita Brooks has become a historian. Okay? Now, what does that tell us? It tells us a lot of things. It tells us, number one, that they're not doing this in a vacuum. History is never written in a vacuum. Other than my autobiography, that's written in a vacuum. Okay? Juanita Brooks brought to these 2 friends' relationship absolute commitment to the topic. She was also an insider. She was right here. The Mountain Meadows story could not have been told in the 1940s and 1950s by anybody except an insider. That is significant. And she's also just very, very good. She's already an accomplished writer. What she's not is a historian yet. Morgan brings some things as well. He's the one that, by the time Mountain Meadows Massacre is published, if you start collating what came from where, he has supplied her with better than half of the material that she cites in her footnotes. Not her work, his work. So he's contributing to this process as well. He is I won't say a better writer because that's not accurate, but he's a better historical writer. And he is giving her criticism over and over and over again. They write sometimes once, twice a week for years as they tease through this long process. Now, the other thing is there's also things that they got. Juanita got basic source material. She couldn't have written Mountain Meadows Massacre without it. She gets insight, she gets encouragement, she gets a listening ear. Remember, St. George is a small town, a couple of thousand people. Not the place that you can talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre when so-and-so's grandfather was there. It's a problem. So she's got somebody on the outside she can talk to. Morgan gets a hero, somebody who is willing to take a risk like he is taking a risk, and being able to write a very important, controversial topic that he feels needs to be addressed and has been overlooked. Okay? So, this is kind of where we have looked at the microhistory. Now, do you see why she's a heroic writer yet? It's there. You can see the elements. The point is that it's hard to see when you're caught up in the details. If you're going to really understand heroicism, you've got to step back a little bit, and that's what macro history is going to be for. So the question then becomes, where does Mountain Meadows Massacre fit into what's going on at the time? Okay? And that's where we're going next. Okay. We're going to talk about Mormon history together. Now, what's going on in the 1940s? Now, you saw both World War II. World War II was not a time to question the United States, right? If you're in the United States and you're there during the war, if you protest, you are a conscientious objector. You are dismissed as a patriotic American. So that kind of leaks over into all kinds of other things that are happening, but especially among the Latter-day Saints. They're still feeling, as they're moving forward into the 20th century, they're finally getting some credit and some attachment to the world at large. And that's important for them and who they are. So the books that are taught and that are written and talked about all have a kind of I won't say a slant because that's not fair, but they have They have a reason for being written, right? Keep in mind, nobody really is interested in Utah, except people in Utah. Nobody is interested in the Latter-day Saints except for other Latter-day Saints. So if you're going to publish books and reprint them and sell them, who are they going to go to? Other Latter-day Saints. So the work that is done is a particular type of work. It's meant to do something. Obviously, it's to congratulate people on their own history, right? And to gild the founders. We want to make them our figures. We want to look up to them. We obviously want to reinforce values. And that's important at that point. The problem is that history at that point in Utah is very much tangled. Latter-day Saint history, Mormon history, is tangled with church authority. Okay? Now, it's not wrong, it's just the way it was. Happens all the time in other settings as well. There's also the problem that there's not very much primary source material. As a matter of fact, there's no library with a Mormon collection in Utah other than the Salt Lake Public Library. That's the only library in the state that has a collection of Mormon material. By the way, they still have most of the same books that they had there. Okay? The challenge becomes that history is a way to tell our story, to make us feel good about our past. Okay? Now, I'm using the word our as an inclusive thing. It means everybody that has an interest in the thing, not the people outside from California and Oregon and Wyoming and places like that. That's not our. Our is we draw lines around ourselves. Okay? The great example, two great examples, only got time for a couple of them. One of them is 1947. J. Reuben Clark, member of the First Presidency, stands up and he gives a landmark talk called To Them of the Last Wagon. Has anybody ever seen that? It was later published. Okay, we've got a few people that have seen that. When you go back and look at that book, what Clark does is he talks about the lowest last wagon who drags in the thing, you know, hard sacrificing pioneer, we're coming to Utah, by golly, we're going to make it, and if I die, too bad, you know, that's the way it works. But we tell that story to draw anybody who came in through, across the plains, into being a hero, into being significant. We are congratulating ourselves on our past. Okay? The other part of that is, another example, is a hymn or a song or whatever that was written and published in 1948 called They the Builders of the Nation. Anybody know that one? They the builders of the nation, blazing trails along the way, stepping stones for generations were their deeds of every day. Sounds like they had a real hard time across the plains, didn't it? Okay? No, it's meant to gild the founders. And if you go into that, go home and look at it. It's a fascinating thing. It always made me feel guilty as a kid singing that. I mean, every day some burden lifted. Every day some heart to cheer. Every day some hope the brighter. Blessed, honored pioneer. I'm not a pioneer. I don't do that. I fight with my sister. Okay? Us into a patriotic idea. Okay? It's the type of history that is intended to inspire and to instruct and to encourage emulation specifically. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong. That's just the history that was written at the time. Okay. The other problem is Utah, especially, is more than just a little proprietary about their stories. You get it, right? Nobody can tell this story but me. I'm the descendant. I'm the one who has the right to tell the story. Okay, now, first off, it isn't just Mormons who do that. I come from the South, too. Okay? We all have things that we feel very close to, partly because it's part of who we are and how we got to places, okay? The challenge is that in the 1930s and in the 1940s, when Juanita is starting to write, there's a new challenge on the block. There's a new style of history that's coming. I better keep clicking this thing, hadn't I? Okay, yeah, there we go. Does that look like you? It doesn't look like me. Okay, number one, you don't hold a flintlock rifle like that. I have one, you don't do that, okay? You'll notice Brigham Young, Erastus Snow, and Wilford Woodruff right there, right? Bronze figures looking over the valley. Now, anybody who has ever read the story recognizes what really happened is Brigham was laying flat in a wagon, right? He's probably vomiting over the side of the wagon. It's not a pretty sight. And yet here he is, standing erect. This is the right place, right? That's the message that this gives. Still on top of the Pioneer Monument up there too, right? Okay. Another good example. This is a really good one. This one is the Utah and Idaho Sugar Company float from the Centennial Parade in 1947. Now, please indulge me in a bit of deconstruction here. Take a look at the way this is constructed. What you can see on the left is the miracle of the gulls. Okay? Supposedly 1848, birds come in and make themselves the state bird, right? They eat up all the crickets that were eating the grain that makes it work, okay? Notice what's on the other side of the float, on the front part of the float. It's kind of hard to see because it goes right off the top. It's the Seagull Monument, a representation of the Seagull Monument. Who's underneath that? A woman gesturing to the pioneers, be like them. Have that kind of faith. Do that kind of work. Honor that forerunner. This is inspirational history. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. But that's a good example of what we're talking about. A couple of things of context. And the next slide is the context. It helps us understand what else is going on. Now we can go to the slide. This is an article that for the first time identified, this is 1969, this is a Swedish sociology student by the name of Moses Rischen. Rischen is writing in the American West Review about this new Mormon history that is coming up. Now this is 1969. It's really interesting stuff. Notice, it's not inspirational history that he's pointing. Now he's quoting Leonard Arrington right here. He says, Mormon religion and its history are subjects to discussion. We can write about them. Okay, that's important. Any feature of Latter-day Saint or Mormon history can be discussed. Nothing is off the table in this new Mormon history. And we can do that study without questioning faith. That is not what the Pioneer Monument says, right? You don't question this kind of story. That's not done because this is to inspire. Rischen says something has happened in the recent past. We'll have to go through it quick, okay? He identifies 3 or 4 major events. Number one, a sociologist who had come and written a book called The Mormons in 1957. And then Arrington's Great Basin Kingdom, 1958. Most people have read, in Utah have read that. That's a really important book. The founding of the Mormon History Association and the founding of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Those are the hallmarks, he says, of this new Mormon history that's beginning to be told. Now, fair enough. I know some of the figures that are here, but there's an earlier story, and that's the story that Juanita Brooks fits into. What he neglects, or what Rischen misses, is the stuff that is being done earlier. Okay? There are at least these 4 works that I think are critical, and what I think is between 1935 and 1950, well before this new Mormon history is being identified, that's where that really happened. That's where there's something happening in the world. We're going to look at the first part of these when I talk about, and we're in the second bit here. Okay. What's in the new Mormon history? What's this new approach that's being talked through? Well, it starts not exactly in 1935 because nobody's really writing in 1935, but it's getting close. A couple of other things are happening. First off, for the first time in Latter-day Saint history, documents are beginning to surface. Juanita Brooks was part of that. The diaries that she and her friends transcribed in the 1930s were part of the beginning of this new availability of documents. Now, it made some people really nervous that this stuff was coming out. And I can't tell all the story there, really. But the most important thing was there's a new approach that had been adopted in the 1930s, a new approach to history and storytelling. And we take it for granted today. We call it documentary. Now, documentary was a form of storytelling that was actually developed in the 1920s. It was called documentary because it was something that seemed more authentic than just stories or inspiration. It was a term that was brought to the United States, and it was so powerful, this new approach was so powerful, that that's what the Historical Records Survey and the Writers Project was really based on. The other part of it was that this new approach to history was telling the stories of ordinary people, not leaders, not prophets. It was the people in St. George, and in Hurricane, and in Cedar City, and places like that. That was a bit of a threat to the inspirational story. You didn't see, on top of the Pioneer Monument, any normal people, right? You only saw leaders, prominent figures. Well, the Depression, especially Depression-era history, had really discredited a lot of that great man history. And we were looking for a new version. It was powerful enough that documentary is still around. In fact, it's probably stronger than ever. It was pioneered during this period when Juanita Brooks began writing. Okay? It's interesting also because Dale Morgan, writes a letter to Bernard DeVoto, who's another Utah expatriate, and he says specifically, Mormonism really was compounded out of the lives of hundreds and thousands. There's more to Mormonism than the lives of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. That's it in a nutshell. This new Mormon history was starting to tell stories of normal folks, people who weren't elites. Now, the problem is that that could be very much a conflict. You could say there's a collision going on, and I think really that's what's happening. For the first time, Latter-day Saints especially were having to confront their own history, and that history is being told out of a whole new set of facts. Things that didn't exist in the official church records. They weren't the stories, they were stories passed down from people. They were in diaries, they were in letters. That's the kind of history that started being told. So when we talk about New Mormon history, it's still a term that's used occasionally, but it really is significant. And that's what's happening during the time that Juanita Brooks and Dale Morgan are writing. So let's take a look at the two of them together and see what's common and what's different. On one hand, Mormon history at that point, traditional Latter-day Saint history, was really published by, for, and about Latter-day Saints. It was written for us, the people at the low levels, to inspire and to lift, right? On the flip side, when you look at what Juanita Brooks did and Nels Anderson did and Dale Morgan and lots of other things, they're publishing outside Utah to talk about Latter-day Saints inside. All of a sudden, Mormonism is on a broader stage. You can't play on Mormonism's rules and cultural rules when you're outside. You have to follow the outside rules. Okay? It could tell our stories the way we wanted to hear them. But there were problems with that because when you got to the outside, you had to be written for somebody over there, right? It was not for Latter-day Saints. How do you explain an insular culture to someone outside it that doesn't belong to it? It's really hard. So you have a different set and form of storytelling. This is an important one, and that is when you look at the way Latter-day Saint history was written, and sometimes tends to be written, it falls very, very heavily on personal narrative. I was there. Now, I was there can happen in different ways, right? This is my recollection. It was based a lot on memoir. It was not based on documentation. It was based on, you're a church leader, I will trust what you say about the founding of the community that you participated in. It's a record of elites. The flip side of it is, documents don't lie. And that was what Juanita had found with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Bull Valley Snort affidavit, the other ones, they were written by people who were there, who were telling another story. It was difficult for folks to swallow. Okay? New Mormon history, the new version of all of this stuff that's happening, is really aimed at telling what is true. The problem is, so is the other form of history. It is true. So when we talk about the challenges of history, it's because we're talking about the same words in different ways. This sense is factual and evidentiary. You can put it out, it's scientific. You can put it on a table, lay things out and say, okay, well, then you reach your own conclusions. You tell me what it is. The flip side is, it's also true, but it's a different kind of true. It's affirming, it's a way to encourage people. It's testimonial. Okay? On the one hand, scientific history, New Mormon history was looking for context. How does it fit in this larger story? And on the other side, you've got a history that's aimed at nostalgia. Okay? Do you see why there was a conflict? Do you see maybe how Juanita fits into this? Which side was she on? Yeah. Okay. She was early in this process. Okay? Now, we're going to go way up high. Way up high. So, Juanita Brooks, Dale Morgan, they kind of disappear into the details because there's lots of other things that are going on. And here's something that I think is a little bit challenging because people don't often think of history as philosophy. It really is. So it's this. History is never about the past. Ever. Who's it for? Who's it by? When I write a book, who buys it? Not my mother. Well, my mother might buy it. No, she would never buy it. It's written for readers today, right? There's no point to write for people who are dead because they don't buy very well. They're not Amazon trolls, right? Okay, so whoever writes history today is writing for the people that surround them. Whether it's inspirational history or whether it's anything else. History is about now. What we choose to tell about the past helps us understand who we are. And I'm getting way out of my notes. Okay? I think what happens between 1930 and 1950, 1960 maybe, is there really is this broad collision between two different views of what history is and what it can do and how it can tell stories and what it can't tell. Now, please keep in mind, this is not limited to Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints are not the only ones who deal with this. In fact, when we talk about this interpretation of history, I gotta see which one it is up here. Oh, okay, James Baldwin. James Baldwin was a black writer, brilliant insight into history. History is us. It's us in the now. It's telling me who I am because of how I have gotten to who I am today. It's literally present, and actually that's part of the thing that we have to understand. This word called presentism. Now, I've used the term inspirational history or patriotic history. Really what that is an approach to the past called presentism. And don't think that I'm pointing fingers at Latter-day Saint history, because presentism is no different than when you or I tell a story to make a point. That's all it is. It means making something relevant to me in the here and now. It's a wonderful way to educate and inspire, but it doesn't have to be true. My grandfather told me all kinds of things that don't have to necessarily be true for me to learn something. Most of them, were involved gloves and hitting me and things like that, but it worked. Okay, what's the flip side? So presentism is this idea of telling a patriotic story, and actually, when you look at it, patriotic history is not even an American invention. It was started up by the Roman writer Livy in the 2nd century BC, because Livy was interested in encouraging patriotism among the rising generation of the people that he wrote around. But it's kind of developed and been a very, very strong thread of interpretation from the past since then, at least in Western cultures. Presentism helps us understand who we are and where we're going and why we're here. Okay, this is a couple of examples of modern Latter-day Saint presentism. It's not wrong, it's not bad necessarily. Okay? Thoreau, I think, really said it very effectively. It's not what you look at, it's what you see. What lesson do you take from the past? Now, if you're a writer, we do presentism. This is a modern photograph. That's not a real Pioneer Company, right? That's an enactment to teach a principle or group of principles, to give people a flavor or a taste of what it was like walking in my $200 boots on a trail, right? With good food at the end, right? And somebody with a van behind me that's got air conditioning in case I fall over. Hey, I've done Hole in the Rock. It really is that bad, okay? That's presentism, modern day presentism. So what's the flip side? Well, it's another kind of approach called historicism. Now, Doug is down here ready to make me say German, okay? Historicism is a different approach. It's looking for context. It's looking for things from the outside, to kind of step back the way we're stepping back in this interpretation and looking at it in the way that it works. How does it fit? What does it really mean? Historicism can be used in a whole bunch of different ways. It's one of the reasons that historians often will take different interpretive lenses. So, for instance, I'm an American social historian. I deal with race a lot. What does race mean? How is it created? How is it crafted? You can do economic history. What does the dollar mean at a particular point in time? You can do environmental history. What does in landscape, how does it affect the way people move and act and interact? Those are all interpretive lenses. It's not true or not true. It's just different ways of looking at and understanding. We do this today too. And here's my German. And please excuse me, Doug, I can't say this properly. Wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. I'm sorry. Told you I would slaughter it. This is an idea that really crops up in the 1850s. Germanic historicism. It's to kind of cut through all of the inspirational legend and story and myth, not myth as in falsehood, just myth as in origin story, to try and explain what actually is there, the best we can from what we can find about it. That gets brought into the United States in some respects, but it really doesn't make a real dent in the storytelling in some cultures until much later. In the Latter-day Saints, it's not really until the 1950s, and Juanita was heavily involved with her books in telling those stories. Okay? Now, if you recognize this is a really good example of historicism in Latter-day Saints. This is the Joseph Smith Papers. The Joseph Smith Papers project may have an ethical background to it, but it's absolutely Simon pure historicism. They want to know the facts about the facts. This is a whole new approach. So when we take a look at this, and when we look at Juanita Brooks, and when we look at Dale Morgan and where they fit into things, they fit into a time where things are starting to shift in the culture. Two very broad conflicts, ways of looking at the past are beginning to collide. It's before the academic stuff really gets going. And often when we talk about New Mormon history, we're talking about Leonard Arrington, George Ellsworth, Doug Alder, and others who begin the academic aspect. And really when we look at New Mormon history, we're looking at a subspecialty of practicing writing historians. Now, Juanita is very early in the process to this. She doesn't have an academic degree. She doesn't train graduate students. But still, she is in that layer of things that are moving forward. History is being told in a different way. Okay? It's not right. It's not wrong. It's just different. And when there are collisions between differing things, people tend to get upset. On the one hand, we talk about ethical history, things that inspire or go forward. In a very negative sense, you want to say something terrible to a historian, call him a utilitarian. Things that history is meant to do. I'm creating this to do this, to persuade. That's bad. Okay. On the other side, on the historicist side, you're really talking about evidence. I'm trying to explain. There's no value judgments, usually. It's just I'm trying to put it into context and explain how things got to the way that they are now. Okay? It's complicated. It involves a couple of friends. And like I said, it's not perfect and it's not over either. Every one of us participate in history in some fashion. Okay? We live the past, the present that we're in. We do things that make sense to other people, and we try to help them understand our experience or our experience in the past. Okay? So let's take a real quick look through here. Have we talked about truth? We've talked about truth. What is true and what's real? Have we talked about, we've talked about fact and where you can get different kinds of fact. We've talked about different forms of perspective. And we've certainly talked about Latter-day Saint history. So I think my job has basically been done, hasn't it? And I stayed under time and I got us out of here before 11. That's pretty good. So I thank you very much for the people for coming. Before you go, I encourage you to go out to the lobby. I brought some goodies. They are probably the three most important two of the three most important copies of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, first edition. They're out there. One is inscribed to Dale Morgan. One is inscribed to an apostle, Delbert Stapley, as he tried to persuade, well, that's a whole other story, but persuade Juanita not to talk about John D. Lee. It has her explanation of why she wrote the book in there. So please go out and take a look at that. If you'd like, come and ask me questions. I'll stay as long as my wife will let me. Okay? Thank you very much.